Hello everyone. I think everyone's starting to roll in. So I think we should start the presentation. Okay, a look into the evolution of natural language processing models and techniques. So introduction. Who am I? My name is Jeffrey Huang, and I am a rising junior living on the East Coast. I got hooked with channels like HeatNav and NativeLang, and that's how I got started with linguistics. And in June, I did the Linguistics Bowl, and now I'm part of LingLeague, which is the organization that's hosting this talk. I combined my love for linguistics and my knowledge of CS to study natural language processing, or NLP. And shameless plug for my GitHub over here. If any of you want to check that out, got some cool stuff. So the goals of this talk. The goals are to have an understanding of the applications of natural language processing in the modern world, and to understand the pros and cons of each learning model and what problems they solved. We're also going to be introducing the ideas in math behind terms like gates and attention. And if we have time, we're going to be learning how to build a sequence-to-sequence model with TensorFlow. So a brief review of machine learning for some people who are getting adventurous and doing an intermediate level talk. So what are neural networks? They are an abstraction of the human brain, and they model neurons in order to produce some output. How do they interpret data? So the way they interpret data is through a variety of ways, and we can see that as that evolves along with neural models. For example, the main way they do it is purely through vectors, but there's many approaches to that. What are some applications? Things include sentiment analysis, word summary, and prediction, because natural language processing is itself a very broad field, and we can tune different models to have different applications and to do well at certain tasks. So here are some helpful assumptions as we go throughout this talk. We have an understanding of how deep learning works and how models actually train, including knowledge of how activation functions work and how backpropagation works. And we'll have at least a small knowledge of linear algebra, just so we don't need to explain like why words need to be vectorized. So where's the current state of natural language processing? Natural language processing, or I'll just say NLP from now on, mouthful, is a very fast field right now. There are tons of new papers coming out. The newest groundbreaking one was in 2017 with transformers. What does it take to get a foothold? Not that much. If you really are an avid learner and you want to go on some sites that I can link in the below in description and on the Hangouts Discord server, then there's some great resources to get started. And that's how I got started. So we're going to be reviewing how do words get encoded to be processed by models. The requirement of words to be interpreted by vectors is a requirement because they need to be compatible with matrix multiplication dot products, unless we have no way to actually do a forward propagation or do any actual math. A naive approach would be to do pure indexing. So that would be saying, let's have a sentence, how do words get encoded? If we want to represent the word how, we use a 1. If we want to present the word do, that's a 2, then 3 and 4. That approach is bad because numerical indexing only works when certain values can be objectively better in some way. For example, you can represent salaries, money, or amounts with numbers because they work well. Like 500 apples is objectively more than 200 apples. But if a word meaning lion is 500 and a word meaning chair is 200, you can't say a lion is objectively better or any heuristic better than the chair. So that's why pure indexing isn't that optimal. We of course have one-hot encoding. This is just having a vector, which is the length of the entire corpus, and having a Boolean value of whether the word is that certain word. So to represent encoded, we do 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, and etc. Word embeddings are more advanced. they are not sparse. So they have a much better efficiency in how they use their memory. Things like bag of words, skip gram context-based, and model-specific training words. 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So the progression of NLP models. So in the early days, before we had models that were language specific, we had artificial neural networks and feed-forward networks. These are classical neural nets that rely on the standard backpropagation and dot products with no recurrent layers or anything. Examples include ANNs and naive Bayes prediction algorithms. And the problem with this is that it's too low of an accuracy to have any real world applications. For example, you couldn't make Siri with ANNs. And another problem is that it only worked on a fixed length of data, meaning that long sentences had to somehow be compressed into a fixed input shape, which would be tuned by hyperparameters. So if you have long sentences, you can't really efficiently feed that into an ANN because you would lose so much context and so much sentence structure. This is a diagram of an ANN. It's very simple. You have the yellow input layer, each could be a word. Then you pass them through some hidden layers with activation and get some output layer result. One thing to note here is that we will be talking about models in the scope of classification models. So no prediction or no generative models, just to keep things simple. So again, we had the problems, they only worked on fixed length input matrices, which means that long sentences had to be compressed in some way. So then evolving, we have support vector machines, which are better. They're the next step, and they're more complex. And the way they worked is they tried to find a way to linearly separate data points into separate categories in order to classify them. So for example, the machine learning model would try to find one vector in some n-dimensional space, which properly separated the data points. And here we can see, for example, blue is one word or one idea cluster, and green is another cluster. Maybe green is food, and maybe blue is, I don't know, furniture. The machine learning model essentially tries to find this red vector, which maximizes the distance between those clusters. And then we can say, okay, given a certain word or sentence, is it above this vector? If it is, then it's blue. If it's below, then it's green. The problem with this is I relied on the data to be linearly separable, and that's not always the case. Techniques like dimensionality reduction and the kernel trick rarely work, to be honest, because at points that the vector representation was so big that the kernel trick wouldn't really work that much. And still it only worked on fixed length data. So then we go into recurrent neural networks. They were an iterative based model having as many layers as it needed to, allowing for any length of data to be passed in. They worked along internal hidden state, which means that as they passed from one node to another, they passed a state or some vector along with it so they could keep context. And they comprise of two sections, encoder and decoder. One analogy I would give for an RNN is, let's say you're trying to find the name of a song and you start on some note and you try to hum the rest of it out to try to figure it out. Like for the national anthem, da 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 da, that's not the national anthem, but you get the point. So how can we do this? There are only 12 notes in the Western classical scale. And if you just said, here's this note, what's the next note? You'll have no idea. That's how hidden state works. It essentially remembers what happened before. Oh, I sang these notes. What should happen next? So that's kind of an analogy to hidden state. And here's a diagram. If we see on the top, this is one of the layers. This arrow feeds back, but if you try to unravel it, it turns into this diagram right here, where you have some node and each of these X subscripts would be a word or an input. And it would pass it through, do some math, and it would spit out some hidden state. Now, this would be something for the feed-forward encoder network. And then you have the same thing for the decoder. And we can see this, that as we put in inputs, they can correspond to outputs and hidden state. So RNN problems, they did fix the problem of having fixed length input. Since they are iterative, they can work on theoretically any length of data, but they had texture generation, loss of context, and there's something called the vanishing gradient problem, which means if you go far along in a sentence, it will lose memory of what happened before. So let's say I said, I come from France. Then I talk for 5 minutes. Then I say, I speak blank. And you want the model to predict what I'm going to say. Well, as humans, we'd be like, oh, they're from France. Most likely they speak French. But the problem with RNNs is that they lose that hidden state as it just goes on through so many more layers. Another problem is a vanishing gradient problem. So if you're familiar with backpropagation, you'll know that the gradient descent is how neural networks learn, by getting the partial derivatives, subtracting by some learning rate, and adjusting the network. With the vanishing gradient problem, if you have some error and you want to propagate it all the way back to, let's say, the first node, the gradient vanishes, which means it essentially turns to 0 because there's just so much to go through. And then some smart people tried to get some sequence models with LSTM and GRU. They are an improved approach to the RNN structure, and they introduce a concept of gates, namely the intention forget gates. So the two main ones are LSTM and GRU. It stands for long short-term memory and gated recurrent unit. And we were able to refer to information that far back in the sentence and selectively pick what aspects are important, essentially attention, which is what to implement. And there's also the idea of recall, in which if you train a network on its training set enough, and if you use its validation set, it should have a closer to accuracy score than the other models. And we can see in an LSTM, voice crack. In an LSTM, it follows the same general structure of RNN, where we have a node feeds into another one, feeds into another one, until the sentence runs short. And we can see that the math behind here is quite more different, because an RNN only worked on one TNH activation function. If we want to follow this through, we can have some input goes through this sigmoid activation right here. If I can recall correctly, this is the forget gate, in which you multiply it by the hidden state with some weights, and then it tells it whether you should forget that certain aspect. And then it passes through the sigmoid and TNH activation function, which helps with attention. And then another sigmoid to squish it. Then you pass all this through some more very complicated math. And then you eventually turn up with hidden state, and you feed that into the next node. And that keeps happening until you reach the end of the decoder network, and then you go back into the decoder network. But we still have some problems. Even though they're better RNNs than for remembering information, they still lose information that was further along the sentence, although they were better than RNNs. And then we have transformers based fully off self-attention. This was introduced by paper by Google in 2017, Attention is All You Need by Vaswani et al. It's structured sort of similar to RNNs because they are, in a sense, iterative. And in the original proposed paper, there are 6 encoding and 6 decoding layers, although this is yet another hyperparameter which can be tuned depending on what model you want to do it for. This was just the one proposed in this specific paper. If we wanted to talk about attention a bit more, we can go back actually. Attention is a mathematical way of selectively deciding what we want to care about. If we say the cat lives in the house, what we first think of is, okay, we think of cat, we think of house. We don't think of articles such as in and the and like those don't matter in the grand scheme of the meaning of the sentence. So a transformer is based solely on self-attention. So it has weights which can actually, I think there's a diagram. This is a lot. Essentially, it has weights which can, do I have not? Okay. It has weights which can train on its own attention to focus on it's listening to. If we want to see, we have some inputs passed through an input embedding, which actually is 3 input embedding layers, if I recall correctly: a tokenizer, targeter, and a position embedding layer, which is right here. And then it passes through attention, and then does a feed-forward network, and then normalization, and then passing through the decoder network. This is another more simplified diagram without that much math. Positional coding, it activates through self-attention, normalizes it, feeds forward, and does the whole thing again until finally it gets some result. Okay. That is the summary of what we have right now. Some common examples of transformers I would say that maybe you would know is GPT-3 and BERT. A lot of open source models are online, such as huggingface.com. I can also link that in the Hangouts. And you can really play with it. Other notes. This timeline only hides the main ones. There are many other neural networks with many other variations and small tunings. And there are many other techniques to improve and solve the problems of the models before a new one was developed. For example, with text generation, there was a GitHub patch for GPT-2, which is now open source, to introduce something called the nucleus sampling. And that essentially helped it. I can show you a fun image from there. But for example, convolutional neural networks work good for sentences and others. And the interesting thing is, while originally transformers in this paper were for natural language processing, we're actually seeing them being used in other fields, such as computer vision. And remember, NLP is not limited to sentiment analysis. There's text generation, there's masking prediction, there's translation. And there's a ton of other things that you should definitely research and definitely look up because it's really cool. Contact info, sources, a lot of stuff. Actually, let me pull up this GitHub issue because it's interesting.
Jeffrey, you're on mute. Are you meaning to?
Oh no, I was on mute. How long was I on mute?
Not that long.
Okay.
Just when you pulled up the sample.
Okay. So this is the GPT-2 simple hosted on GitHub. And the issue is improved sampling with nucleus sampling. And if we see, there's some proposal, and then the maintainer says, although neat, that's beyond the scope of this package, essentially saying, this is cool, but it's not necessary to be implemented. He closes it. The next day, reopens it and says, never mind, Neil Shepard added an implementation for it at this commit. I can merge that. And he just adds it to the thing, which just goes to show like there's just so many advancements happening so quickly. It's really fast paced. Okay, I think we have time for questions now. Okay.
Yeah, you guys can just like raise your hand on the Zoom or send the questions into the chat.
Okay, it seems we have no questions. I did my job. Okay. Thank you for tuning into this talk. It's really been an honor presenting at a conference like Talk. Yeah, do NLP.
And if you guys want to join the Hangout server, which is a linguistics Discord server that Jeffrey was referencing, I'm linking it in the chat right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, have a good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good day, good morning, wherever you are.
All right. Bye, everyone.